You think you know history? Think again. Picture this: Christopher Columbus, the bold explorer who proved the Earth was round by sailing across the Atlantic. Right? Wrong. That's one of the most stubborn myths we've all been taught. But here's the truth. By the late 15th century, educated people already knew the Earth wasn't flat. In fact, Columbus's voyage was controversial, not because people feared he'd sail off the edge of the world, but because they thought he'd underestimated the distance to Asia, which he had. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. History is full of stories we've accepted without question, tales passed down through generations that turn out to be misunderstandings, exaggerations, or outright fabrications. Why does this happen? Because history isn't just a record of facts, it's a story shaped by the people who tell it. Winners write the textbooks, legends grow taller with time. And sometimes a simple mistake gets repeated so often that it becomes common knowledge. But what if we could peel back those layers and see what really happened? That's exactly what we're doing today. We're diving into 30 of the most persistent historical misconceptions, the kind you've probably heard 100 times in classrooms, movies, even documentaries. Some will shock you, others might make you laugh, and a few might just change how you see the past forever. This isn't just about setting the record straight, it's about uncovering the humanity behind these myths. Why did we believe them in the first place? What do they reveal about how we remember and misremember the past? From Cleopatra's beauty to Napoleon's height, from the Salem Witch Trials to the myth of the Dark Ages, we'll explore how these stories took hold and why they've lasted so long. So buckle up, by the time we're done, you'll never look at history the same way again. And who knows, the next time someone drops one of these myths in conversation, you might just be the one to tell them it's not that simple. You've seen them in movies, video games, even sports mascots, the fierce Viking warrior charging into battle with gleaming horns jutting from his helmet. It's an iconic image, but here's the shocking truth. Vikings never wore horned helmets, not in battle, not in ceremonies, not even for fashion. The myth was born centuries after the Viking Age ended, thanks to a 19th century costume designer named Carl Emil Doppler. When Richard Wagner staged his famous opera The Ring of the Nibelung, Doppler sketched dramatic, horned helmets for the Viking-inspired characters, and the idea caught fire. Artists and storytellers ran with it, turning a theatrical flourish into so-called historical fact. But real Viking helmets, they were the opposite of flashy. Archaeologists have uncovered only a handful of intact examples, and every single one is a simple, rounded design made of iron or leather. No horns, no wings, no dramatic embellishments. These were practical warriors, not stage performers. A horned helmet would have been a liability in combat, snagging on weapons or giving opponents an easy handle to yank you off balance. So why does the myth endure? Because it's thrilling. The horned helmet transforms Vikings from skilled traders and explorers into barbaric caricatures, a symbol of wildness that's easier to market than the nuanced truth. Even today, pop culture can't quit the fantasy. From comic books to beer logos, the horns persist, proving how easily a single creative choice can rewrite history in the public imagination. But next time you see that cliché, remember, real Vikings were too busy sailing across oceans and founding cities to worry about looking like a heavy metal album cover. Here's another historical myth that's been blown way out of proportion. Napoleon Bonaparte, the legendary French emperor, was supposedly a tiny, angry man with a height complex. The image of Napoleon the Short is so ingrained in pop culture that we even have a term for it, the Napoleon complex, describing someone who overcompensates for their stature with aggressive behavior. But here's the truth, Napoleon wasn't short for his time. In fact, he stood around 5 feet 6 or 7 inches tall, completely average for a Frenchman in the early 19th century. So how did this myth take hold? Blame it on a mix of British propaganda and a simple case of mistranslation. After Napoleon's rise to power, British cartoonists and writers loved depicting him as a comically small, petulant figure, a way to undermine his intimidating reputation. But the real confusion came from measurements. French inches were slightly longer than British inches, so when British sources reported Napoleon's height as 5'2", they were accidentally shaving off a few crucial inches. The mistake stuck, and the caricature grew stronger than the reality. What's fascinating is how this myth reveals the power of perception in shaping history. Napoleon's enemies didn't just want to defeat him, they wanted to diminish him quite literally. The idea of a small conqueror was too tempting to resist, playing into stereotypes about arrogance and insecurity. Yet in reality, Napoleon's height was the least remarkable thing about him. He commanded armies, reshaped Europe, and left a legacy that had nothing to do with how tall he stood. The myth endures because it's a great story, one that oversimplifies a complex man into a single, digestible flaw. But next time you hear someone joke about the Napoleon complex, remember, history's most famous short king was actually just an average guy who happened to change the world. Think the Great Wall of China is the only man-made structure you can see from space. It's a claim you've probably heard in school books, documentaries, even travel guides, but it's completely false. Not a single astronaut has ever reported seeing the Great Wall from orbit with the naked eye, and science explains why. Despite stretching over 13,000 miles, the wall is only about 30 feet wide in most places, roughly the same width as a highway. From space, that's like trying to spot a single strand of spaghetti from a mile away. The colors of the wall also blend into the surrounding terrain, making it virtually invisible against the natural landscape. So where did this myth come from? The idea seems to have taken root in Western classrooms as early as the 1930s, long before humans ever left Earth's atmosphere. Back then, people imagined space travel would give them godlike vision, an easy assumption when no one had actually been up there to check. The myth gained traction because it fed into a romanticized view of the wall as this colossal, superhuman achievement. Even though astronauts like China's own Yonglue confirmed they couldn't see it, the legend stubbornly persisted. Here's the real kicker: there are man-made structures visible from space, just not the ones you'd expect. Cities at night glow with electric light, massive highways carve dark lines across deserts, and even some airport runways stand out, but ancient stone walls. Not a chance. The myth endures because it's poetic, a way to marvel at human ambition. The truth, though, the Great Wall's real awe lies not in some imagined view from orbit, but in the sheer determination of the millions who built it, one brick at a time, right here on Earth. Christopher Columbus never had to convince anyone the Earth was round because no educated person in the late 15th century seriously believed it was flat. That myth came centuries later, thanks to writers like Washington Irving, who spun dramatic tales in the 1800s about Columbus defiantly proving Earth's roundness to a crowd of superstitious doubters. The truth, scholars had known the planet was spherical since ancient Greece. Even medieval monks taught basic astronomy with globes. Columbus's real challenge wasn't overcoming flat earthers. It was convincing patrons he could reach Asia by sailing west, a gamble many experts rightly thought would fail because they knew the Earth was far larger than Columbus claimed. His stubborn miscalculation almost doomed his crew. Had the Americas not existed exactly where he expected Asia to be, his ships would have run out of supplies in the vast emptiness of the Atlantic. So why did the flat Earth myth take hold? 19th century Americans craft heroic origin stories, and Irving's embellished biography turned Columbus into a scientific rebel, a lone genius battling ignorance. It was a tempting narrative, especially for a young nation eager to celebrate exploration as progress. But in reality, Columbus's voyage wasn't about science. It was about spices, wealth, and cutting out the middlemen in the lucrative Asian trade routes. The irony, the very scholars Columbus dismissed as flat earthers were actually right. They'd calculated the Earth's circumference far more accurately than he had. His accidental discovery only happened because he'd stubbornly clung to bad math. Yet this flawed gambler became immortalized as a visionary, while the real scientific minds of his era faded into footnotes. The myth persists because it simplifies history into a tidy underdog story, when the truth is far messier and far more human. Columbus wasn't a revolutionary thinker. He was just lucky, and that's the real lesson here. Sometimes the myths we cling to say more about what we want from history than what actually happened. The so-called Dark Ages weren't dark at all unless you're talking about the lighting in a medieval monastery. This enduring myth paints the centuries between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance as a cultural wasteland, where humanity supposedly forgot how to think, create, or innovate. But dig a little deeper and you'll find a vibrant era of progress hiding beneath the label. The truth, the Dark Ages were anything but stagnant. Consider this: while Western Europe was reorganizing after Rome's collapse, the Islamic world was experiencing a golden age, preserving and expanding upon ancient Greek texts, pioneering breakthroughs in medicine, mathematics, and astronomy. Meanwhile, in Europe itself, monasteries became hubs of learning, meticulously copying manuscripts and keeping knowledge alive. Charlemagne's court scholars revived classical education, laying the groundwork for universities. Gothic cathedrals, those soaring masterpieces of engineering, weren't built by idiots. They required advanced math and physics. Even the humble plow was reinvented during this period, revolutionizing agriculture and feeding growing populations. So why the bad reputation? Blame it on Renaissance propaganda. Thinkers like Petrarch, eager to promote their own era as a rebirth of classical glory, framed the Middle Ages as a bleak interruption. Later, Enlightenment writers doubled down, using the term Dark Ages to contrast their Age of Reason with what they saw as superstitious backwardness. It was a clever rhetorical trick. By exaggerating the past's failures, they made their own achievements seem more dazzling. But history isn't a zero-sum game. Progress doesn't vanish just because it's inconvenient to someone else's narrative. The Middle Ages gave us the first universities, the foundations of modern law, and breathtaking art that still moves us today. The real darkness, it's in our own reluctance to see the past on its own terms, instead of as a foil for the present. Next time someone dismisses 1,000 years of human ingenuity as a dark age, remember, the light was always there. We just forgot where to look. Marie Antoinette may be history's most famous pastry enthusiast, at least according to the legend that has her coldly dismissing starving peasants with the phrase, "Let them eat cake." But here's the bitter truth: she never said it. The quote was already a tired cliché by the time the French queen was a teenager, appearing in philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau's writings when Marie Antoinette was just 9 years old. Rousseau attributed the callous remark to an unnamed great princess, long before Marie Antoinette ever set foot in Versailles. So why did this fictional slapstick moment stick to her like powdered sugar on a croissant? Because it fit the narrative revolutionaries needed. By the 1790s, France was boiling over with rage at the monarchy's extravagance while bread prices skyrocketed. Marie Antoinette, a foreign-born queen with a taste for luxury, became the perfect scapegoat. Pamphleteers and political enemies latched onto the cake quote, transforming it from an old rumor into a symbol of royal disconnect. Never mind that the real Marie Antoinette was actually deeply concerned about famine, donating generously to charities and even reducing her household spending during shortages. The myth was too delicious to resist. The irony, the phrase itself was likely never meant to be taken literally. In 18th century France, cake might have referred to the burnt crusts of bread bakers were legally required to sell cheaply during shortages. A tone-deaf suggestion, yes, but not quite the glib cruelty we imagine today. Yet 200 years later, the lie still overshadows the truth. That's the power of a good story. It doesn't need evidence, just emotional resonance. A queen nibbling cake while her people starve is a far better villain than a complex woman trapped by circumstance. The myth endures because it simplifies inequality into a single, damning soundbite. But history isn't a morality play. The real Marie Antoinette was flawed, yes, but she wasn't the cartoonish villain we've made her out to be. And that's the real lesson here. When we turn people into symbols, we lose the messy, human truth beneath the frosting. The image is seared into our collective imagination, accused witches tied to stakes, flames licking at their feet as a Puritan crowd watches in judgment. But here's the twist that never happened in Salem, not once. Despite Hollywood's love affair with dramatic witch burnings, the Salem Witch Trials of 1692 played out very differently. Of the 20 people executed during the hysteria, 19 were hanged, and one elderly man was pressed to death under heavy stones. A brutal method, but not a single torch was lit. So why do we so often picture burning witches when we think of Salem? Blame the cultural blender. European witch trials, particularly in Germany and Scotland, did frequently end in flames, a practice rooted in medieval interpretations of religious law that saw fire as purification. Centuries of folklore and fiction later, those continental horrors got mashed together with Salem's story, creating a composite nightmare that feels truer than the facts. Even historical dramas like The Crucible can't resist adding smoky pyres for effect. But the reality in Salem was grim enough without exaggeration. Accused witches, mostly women, but also men, faced spectral evidence, coerced confessions, and a legal system that treated superstition as fact. The gallows, not the stake, were the end point for those like Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old grandmother whose quiet piety couldn't save her from the noose. The difference in execution methods speaks volumes. Europe's burnings were public spectacles meant to eradicate evil, while Salem's hangings were quieter, almost clinical, as if the town wanted to dispose of a problem rather than stage a morality play. The persistence of the burning myth reveals something unsettling about how we remember tragedy. Fire is visceral, cinematic. It turns history into a cautionary tale with clear villains and victims. But Salem's true horror wasn't in its method of killing. It was in the speed at which ordinary people turned on their neighbors over whispers and dreams. That's a darkness no flame could ever illuminate. The idea that medieval people believed the earth was flat is one of history's most stubborn myths, but it's also one of the easiest to debunk. Long before Columbus set sail, scholars across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia had not only accepted the Earth's roundness, but were calculating its circumference with surprising accuracy. As far back as ancient Greece, thinkers like Pythagoras and Aristotle argued for a spherical Earth based on observations of lunar eclipses and the curvature of shadows. By the Middle Ages, this wasn't controversial knowledge, it was textbook stuff. Monks studied astronomy using globes, and even the most devout Christian scholars saw no conflict between faith and a round planet. So where did the flat Earth myth come from? Blame 19th century culture wars. In the era of Darwin and scientific skepticism, writers like Washington Irving and John Draper popularized the idea of a medieval dark age where religion suppressed rational thought. They painted the church as a villain stamping out progress, and the flat Earth became a perfect symbol of this supposed backwardness. The irony, these critics were the ones rewriting history. Medieval manuscripts, like those by the Venerable Bede or Thomas Aquinas, explicitly describe the Earth as a sphere. Even Dante's Divine Comedy, written in the 14th century, imagines a round world with the southern hemisphere mirroring the north. The myth stuck because it served a purpose. For Enlightenment thinkers and later skeptics, exaggerating medieval ignorance made their own era seem more enlightened by contrast. It's a pattern we've seen before, simplifying the past to fit a narrative about progress, but the truth is far more interesting. medieval scholars weren't fools. They built on ancient knowledge while making their own advancements. The real flat Earth conspiracy, it's the one we invented centuries later to make ourselves feel superior. Next time someone claims the Middle Ages were a time of universal superstition, remember, the only thing flat here is the myth itself. The Iron Maiden is one of those chilling images we associate with medieval cruelty, a towering, spike-lined coffin designed to slowly impale its victims. It's been featured in horror movies, heavy metal album art, and even museum displays as a symbol of the Dark Ages' brutality. But here's the unsettling truth. There's no evidence this device existed before the 18th century, let alone the Middle Ages. The Iron Maiden, as we know, it was likely cooked up by over-enthusiastic museum curators and Gothic novelists who wanted to make the past seem even more barbaric than it was. The first detailed description of an Iron Maiden appears in the late 1700s, when German historian Johann Siebenkees claimed to have found records of a spiked execution device used in Nuremberg in 1515. But here's the catch: no medieval documents, court records, or even gossipy chronicles from that era mention anything resembling it. The so-called original Iron Maiden displayed in museums today. Most were cobbled together in the 19th century when Europe was obsessed with dramatizing medieval history. Gothic literature, with its love of macabre spectacle, latched onto the idea, and soon the fictional device became fact through sheer repetition. Why did this fabrication stick? Because it fits our stereotype of the Middle Ages as a time of unchecked sadism. We imagine dank dungeons and cackling torturers, and the Iron Maiden is the perfect prop for that fantasy. Real medieval torture devices like the rack or the pillory were brutal enough, but they lacked the theatrical flair of a spiked sarcophagus. The Iron Maiden's exaggerated horror made it irresistible to collectors and storytellers who retroactively inserted it into history. The irony: by inventing fake atrocities, we've overshadowed the very real and often more disturbing methods of punishment that actually existed. The Middle Ages didn't need spikes in a box to be cruel. They had plenty of their own grim innovations. The persistence of the Iron Maiden myth reminds us how easily fiction can rewrite history when it tells a story we're eager to believe. Next time you see one in a museum, remember, sometimes the scariest thing about the past is what we've imagined into it. George Washington's wooden teeth are one of those quirky historical facts that sound too bizarre not to be true, but here's the reality: his dentures were never made of wood. The first president's dental troubles were very real, though. By the time he took office at age 57, he had only one natural tooth left, and his custom-fitted dentures were a Frankenstein's monster of materials: carved hippopotamus ivory, springs of gold, screws of brass, and even teeth harvested from cows, horses, and, disturbingly, his enslaved workers. So why the wooden teeth myth? Part of it comes from the appearance of his dentures over time. Ivory, when stained by wine or coffee, can take on a grainy, wood-like texture, and observers who glimpsed Washington's grimacing smile might have jumped to conclusions. But the bigger reason is folklore. Early 19th century biographies, eager to paint Washington as a humble, homespun hero, latched onto the idea of wooden teeth as a symbol of his austerity. Never mind that real wooden dentures would have been agony, splintering in the mouth, swelling with saliva, and breeding bacteria. The myth was more appealing than the messy truth that one of America's wealthiest men relied on a patchwork of animal parts and human teeth to chew his food. And those human teeth, that's the darkest footnote. Letters and ledger entries confirm Washington purchased teeth from enslaved people at Mount Vernon for about $6 per tooth, a transaction that reveals more about power than dentistry. The myth of wooden teeth sanitizes this history, turning an unsettling reality into a folksy anecdote. But the real story is a reminder: even legends have cavities. Next time you hear about Washington's wooden grin, remember, the truth is far stranger and far more revealing than the fairy tale. the Library of Alexandria wasn't lost in a single, tragic blaze, no matter how many times Hollywood tells you otherwise. The idea of a lone fire wiping out humanity's greatest repository of knowledge makes for a dramatic scene, but the truth is far more complicated. The library's decline was a slow unraveling, a series of blows spanning centuries, each chipping away at its brilliance until little remained. First, let's set the record straight. There was a fire. In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar's troops famously set ships ablaze in Alexandria's harbor during a civil war, and flames reportedly spread to parts of the city, including warehouses near the library. But here's the twist: historians like Strabo and Plutarch mention the loss of scrolls stored near the docks, not the library itself. Even if some texts burned, the library as an institution survived for centuries after. The real damage came later, from a mix of budget cuts, political neglect, and religious purges. By the 3rd century CE, the library was already a shadow of its former self. Roman emperors, more interested in funding armies than philosophers, slashed its resources. Then came the rise of Christianity, which saw pagan knowledge as a threat. In 391 CE, riots between Christians and pagans led to the destruction of the Serapeum, a temple that housed a secondary collection of the library's scrolls. But even this wasn't the final blow. Scholars argue that by the time Muslim armies arrived in the 7th century, the library was already gone, its collections scattered, sold, or repurposed into fuel long before anyone shouted, "Burn the books." Why does the single fire myth persist? Because it's satisfying. A catastrophic event gives us a clear villain: Caesar's recklessness, religious fanaticism, or foreign invaders. But history rarely has tidy endings. The library's real story is one of slow erosion, of knowledge fading not with a bang but a whimper. And that's a harder truth to swallow. Greatness isn't always destroyed. Sometimes it's just allowed to wither away piece by piece until one day no one remembers what was lost. The myth also obscures something profound. The library wasn't just a building. It was an idea, one that outlived its physical form. Scholars fleeing Alexandria carried texts to Baghdad, Constantinople, and beyond, seeding new centers of learning. The destruction narrative ignores how knowledge, like water, finds cracks to flow through. So next time you hear about the library's tragic fire, remember, the real lesson isn't about how we lose wisdom. It's about how stubbornly it survives. Hollywood loves a bloodbath, and nowhere is that clearer than in the way gladiator fights are portrayed: doomed men hacking each other apart in a sandy arena, with only one walking away alive. But here's the truth: gladiators were more like professional athletes than disposable cannon fodder. These fighters were valuable investments, trained over years at great expense, and their owners had no interest in seeing them die pointlessly. Think of it this way: you wouldn't buy a racehorse just to shoot it after one lap. Most gladiatorial matches had strict rules, referees, and even safety measures. Fights often ended when one combatant signaled surrender, and many bouts were decided by judges or crowd reaction, not death. Archaeologists studying gladiator graves have found evidence of healed wounds, proving many survived multiple matches. Some even earned their freedom, retiring with pensions or becoming trainers. The Colosseum wasn't a slaughterhouse, it was a spectacle, closer to modern boxing or WWE than a snuff film. So why the myth of non-stop carnage? Blame Emperor Commodus, who took the games to grotesque extremes in the late 2nd century. Obsessed with casting himself as a gladiator god, he staged fights with rigged outcomes, massacred disabled prisoners, and turned the arena into his personal playground of cruelty. His reign warped history's memory of gladiators, just as reality TV distorts everyday life. Later Christian writers, eager to demonize pagan Rome, amplified these tales, turning rare horrors into the default image of the games. The real scandal: the deaths that did happen were often political theater. Condemned criminals or prisoners of war, not professional gladiators, were the ones thrown to lions or forced into no-win battles. The professionals, they had fans, endorsement deals, and graffiti praising their skills. The next time you see a movie where every fight ends in a corpse, remember, history's most famous warriors were more likely to bow out gracefully than bleed out dramatically. The arena was brutal, but it wasn't that simple. The Wild West wasn't nearly as wild as Hollywood would have you believe. Forget those dusty streets echoing with gunfire at high noon. The reality of frontier towns was far less dramatic. While movies and dime novels painted the West as a lawless free-for-all where every saloon housed a shootout, historical records tell a different story. In places like Dodge City or Tombstone, the annual homicide rate was often lower than in modern American cities. Dodge City, infamous for its rowdy reputation, averaged just 1 killing per year during its peak. Compare that to the 50-plus murders per 100,000 people in some U.S. cities today, and suddenly the lawless frontier seems downright orderly. So where did the myth of non-stop violence come from? Enter the dime novels of the late 19th century. These cheap, sensational books transformed real-life figures like Billy the Kid and Wyatt Earp into larger-than-life legends, embellishing their exploits with fictional gunfights and endless drama. By the time Hollywood got hold of these stories in the 20th century, the Wild West had become pure fantasy, a place where every disagreement ended in a duel and outlaws outnumbered lawmen 10 to 1. The truth, most frontier towns had strict gun control laws. Visitors were often required to check their firearms at the sheriff's office upon arrival, and public brawls were more likely to end in fines than bloodshed. The real violence of the West wasn't in the streets, it was in the land grabs, the displacement of native tribes, and the ruthless expansion of railroads and cattle empires. But those stories lacked the flash of a quick-draw showdown, so they got buried under layers of myth. Even famous gunfights like the O.K. Corral were outliers, not the norm. That legendary shootout lasted all of 30 seconds and involved just 30 shots, hardly the epic battle later retellings would suggest. What's fascinating is how these exaggerations served a purpose. The myth of the Wild West gave America an origin story full of rugged individualism and moral clarity, where good guys and bad guys were easy to spot. The messy, bureaucratic reality of land disputes, cattle contracts, and tedious court hearings didn't have the same appeal. But next time you see a cowboy movie, remember, the most dangerous thing about the Old West wasn't the bullets. It was the tall tales that refused to die. That iconic image of the Pilgrims' somber figures in stark black outfits, their hats clamped down with shiny buckles, is as ingrained in American culture as turkey and pumpkin pie. But here's the twist: the Pilgrims of Plymouth Colony would have laughed at the idea. The real settlers dressed in a rainbow of earthy hues, muted greens, browns, rust reds, even deep blues, far from the monochrome Puritans we picture today. And those buckles, they didn't appear on hats for another 50 years, and even then, they were a European fashion trend, not Pilgrim practicality. So how did this dour, buckled-up look become the unofficial uniform of Thanksgiving? Blame the 19th century's love of historical revisionism. Artists like Jenny Brownscombe, whose sentimental paintings of the first Thanksgiving adorned schoolrooms and holiday cards, dressed the Pilgrims in the stiff, black garb of their own Victorian era, mistaking austerity for authenticity. The buckle, a symbol of old world order, got tacked on as a visual shorthand for colonial. By the time Norman Rockwell's illustrations cemented the image in the 20th century, the myth was set in stone, or at least in crayon and construction paper. But archaeology and wills from the period tell a different story. Pilgrim inventories list clothing in colors like russet and goose-turd green. Yes, that was a real shade. Their fabrics were sturdy wool and linen, not the stiff, funereal black we imagine. Even their famed steeple hats were softer, more rounded, and buckle-free. The real irony: the Puritans, often lumped in with the Pilgrims, did favor darker colors, but as a matter of economy, not piety. dyes were expensive and black faded less noticeably over time. The buckled hat myth endures because it simplifies a complex history into a tidy symbol. It turns real people, farmers, parents, survivors of a brutal winter, into cardboard cutouts stripped of their individuality. The next time you see a Thanksgiving decoration, remember, the pilgrims weren't dressing for a summer pageant. They were just wearing the 17th century equivalent of workwear, trying to stay warm in a land far from home. And that's a story worth more than any myth. Albert Einstein flunking math class is one of those comforting myths we tell ourselves, proof that even geniuses start out as underdogs. But the truth, young Einstein wasn't struggling with numbers. He was already years ahead of his classmates. By age 12, he'd taught himself geometry and calculus for fun, describing Euclidean proofs as so beautiful they made him physically tremble. His school records from Switzerland's Aargau Cantonal School show top marks in algebra and physics, with one slight dip in French hardly the report card of a future dropout. So where did this myth come from? The confusion traces back to a mix-up in early biographies. When Einstein's school switched its grading system, some later writers misinterpreted a temporary 6, the lowest score under the new scale, as proof of his failure, not realizing it replaced a previous one, the highest score under the old system. The story stuck because it fit a cultural craving, the idea that brilliance can bloom from humble beginnings. We love rooting for the misfit who overcomes early setbacks, and Einstein's wild-haired, sockless professor persona made him the perfect candidate for this rags-to-riches narrative. But Einstein himself bristled at the myth. When a journalist once asked about his supposed math failures, he reportedly replied, "I never failed in mathematics. Before I was 15, I had mastered differential and integral calculus." His real struggle wasn't with academics but with the rigid discipline of German schools, where he chafed under authoritarian teaching methods. He later credited his intellectual breakthroughs to the freedom he found in Switzerland's more open classrooms, where curiosity was nurtured, not crushed. The myth endures because it's seductive. It suggests genius is accidental, that anyone could be a hidden Einstein if only their talents were recognized in time. But the real story is more inspiring. Einstein's greatness came from relentless curiosity, not luck. He devoured books, questioned everything, and saw the universe as a puzzle waiting to be solved. That's the real lesson, not that he triumphed over failure, but that he never stopped playing with ideas, even when the world wasn't watching. So next time someone says Einstein was bad at math, remind them, the only thing he failed at was being ordinary. The Emancipation Proclamation is often taught as Lincoln's grand moral stroke that shattered slavery overnight, but the truth is far more complicated. Signed on January 1, 1863, the proclamation was actually a carefully calculated wartime tactic, not the blanket liberation we imagine. It explicitly applied only to enslaved people in Confederate states still in rebellion, leaving over 500,000 men and women legally enslaved in Union-loyal border states like Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri. Even in the South, it freed no one immediately. Its power depended entirely on Union military victories to enforce it. Why the selective approach? Because Lincoln's priority wasn't just abolition, it was preserving the Union. Border states were teetering on the edge of joining the Confederacy, and outright abolition might have pushed them over. The proclamation was a weapon of war, designed to cripple the South's labor force while keeping fragile alliances intact. Enslaved people in rebel territories were declared free not purely on principle, but because their labor fueled the Confederate war machine. Strip that away and you weaken the enemy. It was strategic as much as it was symbolic, yet over time, the proclamation's messy realities were sanded down into a simpler story. By the 20th century, it had become a shining moment of moral clarity, with Lincoln as the great emancipator striking down slavery with a single pen stroke. The nuance, the exemptions, the political maneuvering faded into the background. part of this was natural myth-making. Nations need unifying narratives. But it also glossed over the uncomfortable truth that slavery's end came grudgingly, piece by piece, through a combination of policy, war, and the relentless courage of enslaved people themselves. The proclamation's limitations didn't go unnoticed at the time. Abolitionists like Frederick Douglass called it a first step, praising its spirit while pushing for broader action. And they got it. The 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, finally outlawed slavery everywhere, but the myth of the proclamation as a definitive ending persists because it's comforting. It lets us imagine slavery crumpled in the face of pure righteousness, rather than through the messy, bloody grind of politics and war. The real story doesn't diminish Lincoln's achievement, it makes it more human. The proclamation was a turning point, but not a magic wand. It reframed the war as a fight for freedom, galvanized black enlistment in the Union Army, and set the stage for total abolition. But it also reminds us that progress rarely happens in a single, glorious moment. More often, it's a series of hard choices, compromises, and half steps forward. And that's the real lesson here. History's most transformative acts aren't always the ones that look best in hindsight. Sometimes they're the ones that do just enough to keep moving forward. The idea that medieval people wallowed in filth, never bathing and living in squalor, is one of history's most persistent and inaccurate stereotypes. While it's true that cities lacked modern sanitation, the average person in the Middle Ages cared far more about cleanliness than we give them credit for. Public bathhouses thrived across Europe, especially in larger towns where they served as social hubs as much as hygiene centers. In London alone, records show at least 18 bathhouses operating by the 13th century, offering hot water, steam rooms, and even basic spa services like hair removal. Monasteries had elaborate washing rituals, with monks required to bathe weekly, and noble households prized scented soaps and perfumes imported from the Middle East. Even peasants, despite limited resources, washed hands and faces daily and laundered clothing regularly using ashes or plant-based soaps. So why does the myth of the dirty Middle Ages endure? Blame the Victorians, 19th century historians, eager to contrast their own era's progress with the backwardness of the past, exaggerated medieval grime to make modern hygiene seem like a triumphant leap forward. The plague also warped perceptions. Later generations assumed the Black Death spread because people were filthy, ignoring the real culprit, fleas on rats. But medieval doctors actually understood more than we think. They knew bad smells could indicate disease, even if they misattributed the cause to miasma rather than bacteria. Surgeons washed tools in hot water or vinegar, and medical texts advised keeping wounds clean to prevent infection. The truth is, medieval hygiene was a mix of practicality and cultural norms. People bathed less in winter when heating water was difficult, but summer saw frequent trips to rivers or bathhouses. Combs, toothpicks, and ear scoops found in archaeological digs prove grooming mattered. And while cities had open sewers, so did Victorian London, hardly proof of one era being uniquely gross. The real shift came later, when religious reformers linked public baths with immorality, and fear of syphilis shuttered many in the 16th century. Ironically, it was the early modern period, not the Middle Ages, that saw hygiene decline. The myth persists because it fits a lazy narrative that humanity stumbled through centuries of ignorance before finally getting things right. But history isn't linear. Medieval people weren't cartoonish mud dwellers. They were humans adapting to their world with the knowledge they had. Next time someone jokes about medieval stench, remember, they probably smelled better than your average 19th century factory worker. And they definitely wouldn't have thrown their chamber pots into the street because, contrary to another myth, most actually used outhouses or designated waste pits. The past was messy, but not in the ways we assume. The Titanic's unsinkable reputation is one of history's most haunting ironies, except it wasn't the shipping line's boast at all. The infamous claim wasn't splashed across posters or brochures before the ship's doomed voyage. In fact, the White Star Line avoided such reckless language entirely. The closest anyone came was a single offhand comment in a trade journal, where an executive mused that the ship's design was practically unsinkable, buried in an article about its watertight compartments. Yet after the iceberg struck, that casual phrasing ballooned into a symbol of human arrogance, a narrative too tempting for newspapers to resist. So why did the myth stick? Because it transformed tragedy into parable. The Titanic's sinking became a morality tale about technological hubris, a warning against mankind's overconfidence. Reporters latched onto the unsinkable label because it made the disaster feel inevitable, not just bad luck, but cosmic comeuppance. The ship's luxurious excesses, like its gilded staircases and lavish menus, only fed the idea that this was punishment for pride. Never mind that the White Star Line had never promised invincibility. The story demanded a villain, and they said it couldn't sink fit perfectly. The exaggeration also glossed over the real engineering marvels of the Titanic. Its watertight compartments were cutting edge for 1912, designed to keep it afloat even with several breached. The tragedy wasn't that builders believed it couldn't sink, it was that they underestimated how much damage an iceberg could do. The compartments weren't tall enough to contain flooding if the ship tilted too far, a flaw no one anticipated until it was too late. But that nuanced failure doesn't pack the same punch as they tempted fate and lost. Even survivors' testimonies got twisted. Many recalled hearing crew members assure passengers the ship was unsinkable during evacuation, but those claims likely emerged after the disaster, colored by the growing myth. In reality, the crew's calm demeanor wasn't overconfidence. It was an attempt to prevent panic, a standard protocol. Yet in retellings, those reassurances became proof of foolishness, not professionalism. The myth's grip on pop culture is unshakable. From films to documentaries, the Titanic is forever the ship that defied nature. But the truth is far more relatable. It was a masterpiece of its time, flawed like all human creations. The real hubris wasn't in claiming perfection, it's in our eagerness to rewrite history as a cautionary fable, where victims become architects of their own demise. The Titanic didn't sink because someone called it unsinkable. It sank because icebergs don't care about marketing, and that's a harder lesson to swallow. Sometimes tragedy is just tragedy. When we picture witch executions, the image that often comes to mind is a terrified woman tied to a stake, flames climbing toward her as onlookers jeer. But here's the startling truth: that gruesome scene never played out in colonial America. While Europe saw thousands of accused witches meet their end in fire, the Salem Witch Trials of 1692 took a different, though no less brutal, path. All 20 victims of that hysteria were executed by hanging, save for Giles Corey, an elderly man who was pressed to death under heavy stones for refusing to enter a plea. Not a single torch was lit in the name of witch hunting on American soil. So why does the fiery stake dominate our imagination? The answer lies in the tangled web of history and folklore. European witch trials, particularly in regions like Germany and Scotland, did frequently use burning as the preferred method of execution. Medieval theologians argued that fire purified the soul, and secular authorities adopted it as a way to leave no bodily remains for potential witchcraft relics. Over centuries, these continental horrors seeped into the collective memory through woodcuts, sermons, and grim fairy tales. Then came 19th-century writers and artists who mashed together European and American witch lore into one dramatic, ahistorical stew. Even Nathaniel Hawthorne's fictionalized account of Salem, written decades after the trials, couldn't resist adding smoky stakes for emotional effect. But the reality in Massachusetts was chilling in its own way. The gallows stood on a rocky hill outside Salem Village, where accused women like Rebecca Nurse, a devout grandmother protesting her innocence until the end, were hanged before crowds. Their bodies were often dumped into shallow graves near the site, denied Christian burial. The absence of fire wasn't about mercy, it reflected Puritan legal codes which reserved burning for crimes like treason or heresy. Witchcraft, in their eyes, was a felony punishable by hanging, a distinction lost to time as the stories merged. What's revealing is how these myths served different cultural purposes. In Europe, burnings were public spectacles meant to showcase absolute authority, the flames erasing both body and sin. In America, the quieter hangings spoke to a different kind of terror, not grand inquisitions, but neighbor turning on neighbor over whispered rumors and spectral evidence. The confusion between the two speaks volumes about how we simplify history. We remember the pyres because fire is visceral, cinematic, a symbol of irrational fear consuming reason. But Salem's horror wasn't in its method of killing. It was in how ordinary people, gripped by panic, could condemn their own friends and family over dreams and hearsay. The myth persists because it turns a complex tragedy into a cautionary fable. Flames make for better morality tales than nooses, but when we strip away the sensationalism, we're left with a harder truth. Injustice doesn't always roar like a blaze. Sometimes it's as quiet as a rope snapping taut in the wind. The Boston Tea Party wasn't a simple tantrum over high taxes, it was a calculated strike against corporate power. On December 16, 1773, American colonists didn't just dump 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor because they couldn't stomach the price. The real target was the East India Company, a British corporation so massive it practically functioned as a shadow government. The Tea Act of that year had granted the company a monopoly, allowing it to sell directly to the colonies at artificially low prices, undercutting local merchants and smugglers. On paper, this even made British tea cheaper, but the colonists saw the trap. By accepting the bargain, they'd be surrendering to a system where economic control equaled political control. Here's the twist: the Tea Act didn't raise taxes. In fact, it kept the existing tea tax from 1767, the very one colonists had protested for years. The outrage wasn't about the cost, it was about who got to set the terms. The East India Company's monopoly meant colonists had no say in where their tea came from, who profited, or how trade was regulated. It was economic coercion disguised as a discount, and Boston's radicals weren't buying it. When 3 ships laden with company tea arrived, the Sons of Liberty gave the governor an ultimatum: send the cargo back to London. When he refused, they staged their now famous midnight raid, disguising themselves as Mohawk warriors to make a pointed statement about who they believed truly owned the land. Simplified versions of this story paint it as a revolt against taxation without representation, but that's only part of the picture. The deeper fear was corporate overreach, a foreign entity dictating terms to an ocean away. The East India Company wasn't just a business, it had its own army, ruled chunks of India, and answered to shareholders, not citizens. Letting it dominate colonial trade would set a dangerous precedent. What stopped it from controlling other goods, squeezing out local economies, or becoming a de facto ruler? The tea was just the first domino. Why does this nuance matter? Because it reshapes how we understand the revolution's roots. This wasn't just a fight over pennies on a price tag. It was about who held power in an emerging global economy. The men who boarded those ships weren't just protesting, they were making a stand against the kind of corporate monopoly that could strangle self-governance before it even began. And that's a lesson that echoes far beyond Boston Harbor. The Mona Lisa wasn't always the global icon we know today. In fact, for centuries, it was just another painting gathering dust in a French palace. Before its infamous theft in 1911, Leonardo da Vinci's masterpiece was far from the most famous work in the Louvre. Art historians of the 19th century barely gave it a second glance, often praising other Renaissance works like Raphael's Sistine Madonna or Titian's Assumption of the Virgin as superior. Even Napoleon, who briefly hung the Mona Lisa in his bedroom, seemed more interested in its royal provenance than its artistic genius. So how did this quiet portrait of a Florentine merchant's wife become the most recognized face in the world? Blame it on a brazen art heist and the birth of modern media. On August 21, 1911, a Louvre handyman named Vincenzo Peruggia walked out of the museum with the Mona Lisa hidden under his smock. The theft wasn't even noticed for 24 hours. Security was so lax that guards assumed the painting had been taken to be photographed. But once the news broke, the frenzy began. Newspapers across Europe and America splashed the story on front pages, turning the crime into a sensational mystery. The Louvre closed for a week, and crowds flocked to stare at the empty space where the painting once hung. For the first time, the Mona Lisa wasn't just a painting, it was a celebrity. The media played up every angle. Was it stolen by a patriotic Italian, a daring anarchist? Even Pablo Picasso was briefly questioned as a suspect. 2 years later, when Peruggia was finally caught trying to sell the painting to an Italian art dealer, the Mona Lisa's fate was sealed. Its recovery made headlines worldwide, and the Louvre displayed it like a returning hero. Suddenly, everyone wanted to see the painting that had captivated the globe. The theft had given it something no amount of artistic genius could: a story. And in the 20th century, stories sold better than beauty. The rise of mass tourism and postcards turned the Mona Lisa into a must-see attraction, while avant-garde artists like Marcel Duchamp parodied it, cementing its place in pop culture. The irony: Leonardo himself might have been baffled by the obsession. He never delivered the portrait to its commissioner, carrying it with him until his death, where it was eventually acquired by King Francis I of France. For centuries, it was just one of many royal treasures admired but not worshipped. The Mona Lisa's fame isn't a tale of timeless genius recognized across the ages. It's a reminder that art becomes legendary not just through skill, but through the unpredictable alchemy of scandal, spectacle, and the public's hunger for a good yarn. Next time you see her enigmatic smile, remember, she wasn't born famous. She was made famous by a thief, a newspaper, and a world learning how to turn art into a sensation. The classic Hollywood cowboy, white, rugged, and speaking in a drawl, is one of the most stubborn myths in American history. The real cattle-driving West was a multicultural tapestry, where nearly 1 in 4 cowboys was black. Mexican vaqueros taught Anglo settlers how to rope and ride, and Native American horsemen were integral to ranching long before cattle drives began. This wasn't just diversity as a footnote, it was the backbone of the frontier economy. Take the legendary black cowboys, for instance. After the Civil War, thousands of formerly enslaved men found work on Texas ranches where their skills with livestock were in high demand. Some, like Bose Ickard, became so trusted they handled money and supplies for cattle barons like Charles Goodnight. Others, like Nat Love, whose autobiography, The Life and Adventures of Nat Love, reads like a dime novel, rode into legend with stories of sharpshooting and rodeo victories. Yet by the time Western films dominated the 20th century, these men had vanished from the story, replaced by the myth of the all-white frontier. Mexican vaqueros, meanwhile, were the original cowboys, their techniques lassoing from horseback, herding with trained dogs. Even the iconic cowboy hat were borrowed by Anglo newcomers who later claimed the culture as their own. The Spanish word vaquero literally means cowman, and their influence stretched from Texas to California. But Hollywood's obsession with manifest destiny turned these skilled horsemen into bandits or sidekicks if they appeared at all. And then there were the native riders. Tribes like the Comanche had mastered horsemanship long before European settlers arrived, and many Native Americans worked as cowboys after being displaced from their land. The Cherokee, Choctaw, and Chickasaw nations even ran their own successful cattle operations. Yet in popular culture, they were reduced to stereotypes, either savage threats or noble sidebars to the real cowboys' adventures. Why does this myth persist? Because the sanitized cowboy fits a simpler national narrative, one where the West was won by rugged individualists, not built through collaboration and conflict. The truth is messier, richer, and far more interesting. Next time you see a Western, remember, the real frontier wasn't black and white. It was a kaleidoscope of cultures, each leaving hoof prints on history. The Spanish Inquisition looms large in our imagination, a byword for merciless torture and fanatical cruelty. But here's the uncomfortable truth: by the standards of its time, it wasn't the bloodthirsty outlier we've been led to believe. While its name still sends shivers down spines, the historical record reveals a far more complicated picture, one where Protestant propaganda and sensationalized storytelling turned a flawed but relatively restrained institution into history's ultimate villain. Let's start with the numbers. Between 1478 and 1834, the Spanish Inquisition executed around 3,000 to 5,000 people, a tragic toll but dwarfed by the secular courts of Europe. In England, Henry VIII's reign saw over 70,000 executions, many for trivial offenses like stealing bread. Germany's witch hunts burned tens of thousands, often on flimsy accusations. Even the Dutch Republic, hailed as a bastion of tolerance, drowned suspected witches or burned them alive. The Inquisition, by contrast, had strict rules of evidence, allowed defendants legal representation, and acquitted nearly half of those accused. Unthinkable leniency in an era where many trials ended with a noose or a stake. So why the brutal reputation? Much of it stems from a deliberate smear campaign by Protestant reformers. When Spain emerged as a Catholic superpower in the 16th century, its enemies had a vested interest in painting the Inquisition as uniquely monstrous. Pamphlets circulated across Europe, filled with exaggerated tales of secret dungeons and indiscriminate torture, many written by people who'd never set foot in Spain. The infamous Black Legend was born, a propaganda war where truth took a backseat to political expediency. Even the Inquisition's most infamous tool, the auto da fe public spectacles of penance or execution, were no more brutal than the standard public hangings or burnings elsewhere. They just made for better horror stories. That's not to whitewash the Inquisition's sins. Its targeting of Jewish and Muslim converts, its censorship, and its psychological terror were very real. But the idea that it was a medieval aberration ignores the context. Torture was legal in most European courts until the 18th century. England's Peine Forte et Dure pressed defendants to death with rocks for refusing to plead. France's witch trials relied on swimming tests that drowned the innocent. The Inquisition's real distinction wasn't its cruelty, it was its bureaucracy. Meticulous records, appeals processes, and centralized control actually curbed some of the worst excesses of local mob justice. The myth persists because it serves a narrative. The Spanish Inquisition became shorthand for religious tyranny, a cautionary tale about dogma run amok. But history is rarely so black and white. The real lesson here isn't that the Inquisition was gentle, it's that every society has its monsters, and sometimes the ones we remember aren't the ones who did the most harm. They're just the ones who made the best villains. Cleopatra's image as the quintessential Egyptian queen is one of history's most persistent illusions because in reality, she was as Greek as a philosopher in the Agora. The last active ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Cleopatra traced her lineage not to the pharaohs of ancient Egypt but to Ptolemy I, a Macedonian general who served under Alexander the Great. When Alexander's empire fractured after his death, Ptolemy claimed Egypt as his own, establishing a royal line that would rule for nearly 300 years. The Ptolemies clung stubbornly to their Hellenistic roots, marrying within the family to preserve their bloodline and rarely bothering to learn the Egyptian language. Cleopatra herself was the first in her dynasty to fluently speak Egyptian, a strategic move that endeared her to her subjects but didn't erase her ancestry. Yet modern depictions, from Elizabeth Taylor's iconic portrayal to Netflix's recent docudrama, can't resist painting her as an exotic North African queen. The controversy over her racial identity reveals more about our own cultural hang-ups than historical fact. Some argue she may have had Persian or other Middle Eastern ancestry due to the Ptolemies' intermarriages, but the evidence is slim. Coin portraits and contemporary descriptions emphasize her Greek features: a prominent nose, sharp chin, not the sultry, dark-eyed seductress of Hollywood lore. Why does this myth endure? Because Egyptology has long been filtered through a lens of Orientalism, where the mysterious East demands a femme fatale at its center. Cleopatra's real genius wasn't her ethnicity but her political savvy. She styled herself as the reincarnation of Isis to legitimize her rule, adopted Egyptian customs to rally support, and famously leveraged her alliances with Rome to keep her kingdom intact. Her power came from adaptability, not bloodline. The modern obsession with her race speaks to a deeper discomfort: how we retrofit history to fit contemporary identity politics. The real Cleopatra was a master of reinvention, a Greek queen who became Egypt's pharaoh because she understood that legitimacy isn't about where you're from, but who you can convince. And that's a lesson that transcends any single culture. The term Dark Ages paints a picture of a world plunged into intellectual shadow, but that gloom only fell over parts of the map. While Western Europe struggled with political fragmentation after Rome's collapse, the Islamic world was entering its most dazzling era of innovation. From the 8th to the 14th century, cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo became beacons of progress, where scholars preserved ancient Greek texts, refined algebra, and built astronomical observatories that mapped the heavens. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad wasn't just a library, it was a bustling crossroads of ideas where Jewish, Christian, and Muslim thinkers collaborated on breakthroughs in medicine, optics, and philosophy. While European monks copied manuscripts by candlelight, Persian polymath Al-Khwarizmi was inventing algorithms, a term derived from his name, and laying the foundations of modern mathematics. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire kept Rome's flame burning in the east. Constantinople's soaring Hagia Sophia, completed in just 5 years during the 6th century, was an engineering marvel unmatched in the West for nearly 1,000 years. Byzantine scholars meticulously preserved classical texts, and their legal code, the Corpus Juris Civilis, became the bedrock of European law. While some in Europe forgot how to make concrete, Byzantine architects were perfecting pendentive domes that seemed to float on light. The myth of universal darkness stems from a narrow Eurocentric lens. Renaissance thinkers, eager to glorify their own rebirth of classical learning, dismissed the Middle Ages as a stagnant gap between antiquity and their own brilliance. Enlightenment writers doubled down, framing the period as a cautionary tale about religious dogmatism. But this narrative ignores the vibrant exchange happening beyond Europe's borders. The translation movements in Toledo, where Arabic texts were rendered into Latin, or the medical schools of Salerno that blended Greek, Arab, and Jewish knowledge. Calling this era dark does more than misrepresent history. It erases the achievements of entire civilizations. The real darkness wasn't in the lack of light, but in the failure to see beyond one corner of the globe. While Europe rebuilt, others were already reaching for the stars. The Statue of Liberty's torch shines bright as an emblem of American freedom, or so we've been told. But this towering icon wasn't conceived as a tribute to the United States at all. Instead, it began as a French political project, a scathing critique of Napoleon III's authoritarian rule disguised as a generous transatlantic gift. Sculptor Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi originally envisioned the statue for Egypt, pitching a colossal Egypt bringing light to Asia for the Suez Canal. When that plan fizzled, he repurposed the concept for America, but with a twist: it became Liberty Enlightening the World, a celebration of republicanism over monarchy. The statue's unveiling in 1886 coincided with France's own rocky transition to democracy, making it as much a commentary on Parisian politics as a gesture of Franco-American friendship. The symbolism was radical for its time. Lady Liberty's broken chains, often overlooked at her feet, represented the abolition of slavery, a nod to the Union's recent victory in the Civil War. Her tablet, inscribed with the date of the Declaration of Independence, subtly endorsed democratic revolutions everywhere, but the statue's most subversive detail. Her face, Bartholdi modeled it after his mother, but her stern, almost defiant expression was a deliberate counterpoint to the soft, maternal figures favored by European monarchies. This wasn't just a statue, it was a manifesto in copper. Yet within decades the narrative shifted. As waves of immigrants poured through Ellis Island, the statue's meaning was rewritten. The famous poem, The New Colossus, penned by Emma Lazarus in 1883, reframed Lady Liberty as a beacon for the huddled masses, a sentiment that initially played no role in the statue's design. The poem wasn't even mounted on the pedestal until 1903, nearly 20 years after Lazarus's death. The transformation was complete by the 1920s, when immigration officials began using the statue in pamphlets to welcome newcomers, cementing its new identity as a symbol of American opportunity rather than Franco-American Republican ideals. The irony, the statue's original anti-monarchy message was so diluted that by the Cold War, U.S. propaganda weaponized her image against the very revolutions Bartholdi might have sympathized with. Today, her torch lights up everything from political campaigns to corporate logos, a blank screen for whatever ideal we project onto it. The real story of Lady Liberty isn't one of fixed symbolism, but of reinvention, proof that even the most monumental truths can be recast by the tides of time. The passengers of the Mayflower didn't call themselves pilgrims, not in 1620, not even decades later. That solemn, reverent title was stitched onto them 2 centuries after they stepped onto Plymouth Rock, a romantic rebranding by 19th century Americans hungry for a unifying origin story. To their contemporaries, these travelers were simply saints or separatists, terms that reflected their religious rebellion rather than any grand quest for freedom. Their real struggle wasn't about founding a new world, it was about escaping the Church of England, which they saw as hopelessly corrupt. Far from the pious pioneers of legend, they were radical dissenters, so extreme that even other Puritans who wanted to reform the church from within considered them fringe fanatics. The myth of the Pilgrims took root in the 1800s, when New England writers and politicians needed a patriotic symbol to paper over the fractures of a young nation. With the Civil War looming, America craved a shared heritage, and the Mayflower's passengers fit the bill. Their story was sanitized, stripped of its messy religious strife, and repackaged as a wholesome tale of perseverance and divine destiny. The word pilgrim, with its echoes of sacred journeys, lent their ordeal a spiritual glow it never originally had. By the time Abraham Lincoln declared Thanksgiving a national holiday in 1863, the transformation was complete. These scrappy, contentious exiles had become the dignified forebears of American virtue. Even their famed First Thanksgiving was reinvented to suit the new narrative. The 1621 Harvest Feast was a casual, 3-day event shared with Wampanoag neighbors, more a diplomatic gesture than a solemn ritual. There's no evidence they called it Thanksgiving, a term reserved for days of prayer and fasting. But 19th century illustrators and storytellers recast it as a hallowed meal, with the saints now pilgrims, as humble hosts blessing a land they'd tamed. The Wampanoag, who outnumbered the English at that feast, were reduced to background players in a pageant of European gratitude. The real irony, the very people we now call pilgrims would have bristled at the term. They saw themselves as exiles, not pioneers, as a beleaguered flock, not founding fathers. Their journals speak of hardship, not heroism, starvation, infighting, and a gnawing fear that God had abandoned them. The Mayflower Compact, often hailed as a democratic landmark, was a desperate stopgap to prevent mutiny, not a blueprint for liberty. Yet none of that fits the tidy fable of pious pilgrims and their pumpkin pies. The lesson here isn't just about labels, it's about who gets to shape history. The separatists didn't choose their legacy. It was chosen for them, sanded smooth to comfort a nation in crisis. The next time you hear the word pilgrim, remember, the past is never just what happened. It's what we need it to be, polished and repurposed for the present. And sometimes the most powerful myths aren't the ones we inherit, they're the ones we invent. The Wild West wasn't the chaotic free-for-all we've been sold. It was a meticulously managed real estate project disguised as a frontier. That iconic word, wild, had less to do with lawlessness and more to do with land, unsettled territory waiting to be catalogued, claimed, and commodified. The myth of an untamed wilderness ignores the speed at which government muscle followed settlers westward. Within years of gold rushes and cattle booms, you'd find courthouses, railroads, and land surveyors carving order into the so-called wild. Take the railroads, the ultimate taming tool. The transcontinental lines didn't just connect coasts, they were mobile extensions of federal authority. Railroad companies acted as quasi-governments, employing their own police forces, setting freight rates, and even dictating town layouts. Where tracks went, so did you. Marshals, telegraph lines, and standardized time zones to synchronize schedules. The wild was being domesticated at 60 miles an hour, one steel rail at a time. Even the famous frontier towns, mythologized as havens of anarchy, were often rigidly controlled. Dodge City had a board of commissioners and a published list of ordinances. Tombstone's Earps weren't rogue vigilantes, they were tax-collecting bureaucrats in boots. Courts operated within months of a town's founding, handling everything from mining disputes to divorce cases. The real violence wasn't between sheriffs and outlaws, it was between ranchers and railroads, settlers and native tribes, all fighting over who got to define what order looked like. The romanticized version of the West as a lawless void persists because it serves a nostalgic purpose. It lets us imagine a time when freedom meant no rules, rather than the messy reality of contracts, land deeds, and bureaucratic turf wars. But history doesn't bend to our fantasies. The West wasn't won with 6 shooters, it was parceled out with paperwork, and that's the real frontier story, not the absence of government but the relentless, unglamorous spread of it. The marble statues and Hollywood epics would have you believe ancient Greece and Rome were homelands of pale, chiseled Europeans, but history's palette was far more vibrant. The Mediterranean wasn't a monolithic white civilization. It was a crossroads of cultures, skin tones, and ethnicities, where North African emperors ruled Rome, Syrian philosophers lectured in Athens, and Egyptian gods mingled with Olympians. Take Septimius Severus, the Roman emperor born in modern-day Libya, whose family roots traced back to Berber and Punic ancestry. His dark complexion was so striking that contemporaries described him as dark-skinned in historical accounts. Or consider Terence, one of Rome's greatest playwrights, who was born enslaved in Carthage and rose to fame with comedies that still echo in modern theater. These weren't outliers, they were threads in a richly woven tapestry. Modern reconstructions of classical busts often bleach away this diversity. The pristine white marble we associate with ancient art is a Renaissance invention. Greek and Roman statues were originally painted in vivid colors, with skin tones reflecting the multicultural world they inhabited. A 4th century fresco from Pompeii shows a banquet scene where attendees range from deep brown to golden tan, a snapshot of Rome's cosmopolitan reality. Even the philosopher Aristotle, often depicted as a pale sage, spent years tutoring Alexander the Great in Macedonia, a region Greeks considered semi-barbaric, where populations mixed with Thracians and other groups. The idea of a pure classical race collapses under scrutiny. Ancient writers like Herodotus described Egyptians as dark-skinned with woolly hair, while the Roman poet Martial mocked a rival for pretending to be darker than he was to seem more authentically Roman. Hollywood's casting choices have only deepened the myth. Films like 300 or Gladiator populate the ancient world with uniformly white faces, erasing figures like the Syrian-born Emperor Philip the Arab or the Nubian-born Saint Maurice, revered in medieval Europe as a black knight. Even the term classical itself has been weaponized. 19th-century art historians claimed the ideal Greek form could only be white, ignoring evidence like the mixed-race communities of Sicilian Magna Graecia or the Egyptian city of Alexandria, where Greek, Jewish, and African scholars collaborated in the legendary library. The real tragedy of this whitening isn't just historical inaccuracy, it's the theft of inheritance. When modern North Africans or Middle Easterners see themselves excluded from Western civilization's origin story, it reinforces the lie that their ancestors contributed nothing to democracy, philosophy, or law. But the parchment of Plato's dialogues could just as easily have been papyrus from the Nile, and the olive trees of Athens shaded thinkers whose heritage spanned 3 continents. The ancient world wasn't a club for one skin tone. It was a marketplace of ideas where wisdom mattered more than melanin, and that's a truth worth chiseling into our collective memory. The Middle Ages weren't a single gloomy chapter in humanity's story. They were an entire library of different eras, cultures, and innovations crammed under one misleading label. Stretching roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, this 1,000-year period saw more diversity than most history textbooks dare to acknowledge. While France was building its first Gothic cathedrals in the 12th century, the Byzantine Empire was preserving Roman law and Greek philosophy in Constantinople. While Viking longships raided England's coasts in the 9th century, the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad was revolutionizing mathematics and medicine in the House of Wisdom. Calling all this a single Middle Ages is like describing both a candlelit manuscript workshop and a Mongol horse archer's saddle as medieval technology, technically true, but spectacularly missing the point. This oversimplification didn't happen by accident. Renaissance scholars coined the term Middle Ages as a dismissive label for the centuries between their cherished classical past and their own enlightened present. Later, Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire cemented the stereotype, portraying the entire period as a backward interlude governed by superstition. But archaeology and primary sources reveal a far more dynamic picture. Take agricultural innovations. The heavy plow, windmills, and crop rotation systems emerged during these centuries, boosting food production and fueling population growth. Or consider mechanical ingenuity. Medieval craftsmen invented eyeglasses, mechanical clocks, and even early blast furnaces long before the Renaissance. Regional differences were staggering. While Western Europe weathered the fallout of Rome's collapse, the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, maintained thriving cities, complex bureaucracy, and naval trade networks. Islamic Spain became a crossroads of learning where Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars translated ancient texts into Latin, preserving knowledge that would later spark scientific revolutions. Meanwhile, Tang Dynasty China and Ghana's gold-rich empire were experiencing their own golden ages completely disconnected from European feudal struggles. The real damage of this flattened view isn't just academic, it warps how we understand progress itself. By lumping together the Black Death, Charlemagne's reign, and Thomas Aquinas's philosophy as interchangeable parts of one dark age, we ignore the seismic shifts happening within those centuries. The 12th century alone saw the rise of universities, the birth of Gothic architecture, and the rediscovery of Aristotle's works, hardly signs of a civilization stuck in neutral. Even the much maligned feudal system wasn't some monolithic oppression machine. It varied wildly between Normandy's strict hierarchies and the comparatively flexible structures of medieval Iceland. What makes this myth so persistent? It's comforting. A single Middle Ages fits neatly between the glory of Rome and the brilliance of the Renaissance, serving as a cautionary tale about what happens when faith overrides reason. But history refuses to be so tidy. The next time you hear someone dismiss 1,000 years of human experience as one long slump, remember, the only thing dark about the Middle Ages is how little light we've bothered to shine on their true complexity. History isn't just a collection of facts, it's a conversation, one that's constantly being rewritten. The misconceptions we've uncovered today reveal something profound. The stories we take for granted often say more about the storytellers than the past itself. Whether it's Vikings in horned helmets or Napoleon's height complex, these myths endure because they fit neatly into the narratives we crave, tales of heroism, folly, or morality. But scratch the surface and you'll find a richer, messier truth waiting beneath. These gaps between popular history and scholarly research aren't just academic footnotes. They shape how we see ourselves and the world. When we reduce the Middle Ages to a dark interlude or pretend Columbus defied a flat Earth, we're not just getting the past wrong, we're missing the chance to understand the real forces that drove it: ambition, adaptation, and the sheer unpredictability of human decisions. History isn't a parade of geniuses and villains. It's a tapestry of ordinary people navigating extraordinary circumstances, often with incomplete information and flawed assumptions not so different from us. That's why questioning these myths matters. It's not about scoring points or debunking for the sake of it. It's about reclaiming the past in all its complexity, where answers are rarely simple and motivations are almost never pure. Every time we correct a misconception, we're not just setting the record straight, we're opening a door to deeper questions. What else have we gotten wrong? Whose voices have been left out of the story, and what might we learn if we're willing to listen? So here's your challenge: don't just take history at face value. Be curious, dig deeper. The next time you hear a fact that sounds too good or too outrageous to be true, chase it down. You might be surprised by what you find. And if you've got a favorite historical correction of your own, drop it in the comments. Let's keep this conversation going. If you enjoyed peeling back the layers of these myths, hit that subscribe button. We've got plenty more where this came from. Because history isn't set in stone. It's alive, evolving, and always ready to surprise us, and honestly, that's what makes it so much fun.